Welcome to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. We are back here in studio with our very own Karli Sewell, who is going to help me discuss obviously this series has been about velocity, but today's discussion specifically is going to be about recovery and the relationship between velocity and recovery. So I thought no better guest to have on than Karli. This is a concept that after we finished our second series, which was all about strength and conditioning for pitchers, we kind of said, we kind of missed out on bringing up the topic of recovery, right? So I thought this was a really, really important topic to cover. Our previous conversations or our previous episodes within this series have really been about how we view velocity at S2 Breakthrough, how we have a little bit more of a broad view of velocity when we're looking at trends and times of year, the types of things that we focus on as far as building it organically through the appropriate stability, trunk control, strength, first and foremost, so that the foundation underneath of velocity is something that can continue to grow. And so I thought today's discussion, we could talk about recovery because it's the piece that we see here that's really like the major roadblock. Like even if we see athletes doing the right things from a training standpoint, like an active standpoint, they get blocked by their ability to really like reap those benefits when recovery is really not appropriately understood and when it's not sort of like in the equation as it should be, right? So anyway, I'm going all over the place, but Karli, welcome back to Redefine the Circle.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. Okay, so let's just start off with talking about the culture. I think anyone who's listening to this episode knows that the culture of softball pitching, like recovery, what is recovery? Like recovery is something like, yes, I pitched 10 days in a row, and so now today I'm taking off. Like it's just a very clear cut, like when I'm so sore I can't move, I don't pitch the next day. But recovery, the way we're going to talk about now, is something that is just constantly flowing in and out of training to allow training effects to really take hold, right? And so I just think recovery is a concept that in softball, it's like we're all over the map. We really don't even have it in discussion. Karli, start with a conversation of why do velocity and recovery even belong in conversation together?
So recovery is going to be all about getting an athlete back to their baseline. So getting an athlete back to their baseline is going to be getting them back to a stable state. And a stable state is going to be a relaxed central nervous system. And when you're talking about generating high quality of power or creating a lot of output, you're looking for a central nervous system that's ready to do so. And when we aren't recovered, we're not at this baseline. We don't have a central nervous system that's ready to efficiently fire. We're typically under-recovered, meaning we're trending down in velocity. And it's really a time to look at the whole picture and what we're missing in terms of that.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. So when you talk about the central nervous system, talk to me like really put this into basic building blocks here. What is the role of the central nervous system in producing power?
So the central nervous system is going to allow for those high bursts to happen. We have a tendency to believe that it's all about muscular output. It's all about how much the muscles are contracting, but we forget that there's a brain-body element. There's a brain-body-muscle element to our game. So you can have the most muscle contractions there are. You can have a lot of hypertrophy, but if your brain, the center of everything, isn't ready to function, you're not going to function. So that is the bare minimum of movement, is having that baseline of readiness.
So it's like we talk about symptoms versus roots. We talk about the foundations of things. You can even think about like when you're recruiting muscles to be able to do something, the base of that is whether or not the brain can function well in order to communicate that, right? That I need you to fire at this rate to produce X, Y, Z.
Exactly.
Okay, so when we are talking about, when you say something like the recovery brings the body, the brain back into its neutral so it can function at its best. Why just say I have a pitcher who's pitching, high outputs, high volume, high intensity all week long? Why is that sort of disrupting that balanced state?
So think of it in terms as you have an empty bucket, and every day you're adding something into that bucket. Eventually that bucket's going to start overflowing at some point. So if we're doing high intensity every day, that bucket's going to start overflowing very quickly. So then this bucket's overflowing, and you have nothing left to add to this bucket. You don't have strength and conditioning. You don't have academic stressors. You don't even have life stressors. So we're quickly overflowing. And then say she has a tournament on the weekend, there's games on the weekend. Well, now that's going to be her worst performance because she doesn't have anything left to give. Everything has already been given. So all stressors are the same. I think that's also a point to make apparent here. And when high intensities every day, you just have nothing left to give.
Yeah, so we're talking about stress, right? And
Yeah.
like not maybe even the traditional way that someone's like stressed, like I'm stressed out because I have an exam. I'm stressed out because, I'm dealing with a relationship issue. It's not just that level. Like we'll get into this in a bit here, but we're thinking about all of these variables, personal life, academically, physically, how you're training, competing. That's stress on the brain and on the body. So when you're talking about bringing the brain back to a neutral, back to a balanced state, what we're saying is like you have to be able to remove as much as possible. Some things obviously cannot be removed, right? There's levels of stress that are impossible to remove, but at the very least we need to remove sort of that physical nature of intensity and sort of power production.
Right. So I think this is a good point and good segue to bring up that recovery is not often about adding things in or subtracting things. Recovery is about controlling the system that your athletes are in, or doing your best to control that system and really looking at the whole picture. So if we know that they're being stressed academically, they're being stressed in life, and we know we're giving them high intensity days, well, maybe we lower those number of high intensity days because they are dealing with a lot. So don't worry about adding in recovery days. Worry about controlling what you can and like modulating that stress.
Yeah, I think that's great. I just think pitching is this is a conversation that could hold for all softball athletes. Obviously we're talking about softball here. I'm sure it expands way beyond our game, but particularly in pitching, it is such a unique position, meaning the level of output, power output that is asked every single repetition of the game. So obviously when it's not your half to be on defense, that's the time for the pitcher to take a break. But generally half of the game, every single rep, she is asked to produce maximum power. There is no other position where that is being asked of anyone else on the ball field. I'm not trying to say that, there are difficulties in every other position in the game, of course, but it's really just about, we have to understand what we're asking. So this series is really all about us not understanding the concept of velocity enough to know whether or not the expectations we're really placing on our pitchers are even feasible. So think about that for a second. Think about what is being asked of her every pitch of the game. It is in itself just like almost beyond what human beings can really do, right? It's crazy how much we ask pitchers, not just in a single day or in a single game, but like day after day after day. And so regardless of what we're doing to be able to like achieve that, regardless of what we're doing in training to be able to, for our pitchers to be able to accomplish things like that, at the very least, whether the training techniques are appropriate or not, the very least you have to recognize what we're asking is almost insane, right? You have to then take a step back and realize like we have to give her a break in order to be able to accomplish these ridiculous demands or expectations that we're placing on her. So that's the concept of recovery, right? Is that like the very least, look yourself in the mirror and recognize that like what pitchers are asked to do is unbelievable. So give them that opportunity to sort of reset in order to be able to accomplish it again on Tuesday, again on Thursday, again on Sunday, right? And that's obviously being generous, like an every other day concept. In travel ball, we're talking pitchers are being asked to accomplish the same level of power, the same outputs, the same results 3 games in a day after day after day. I mean, this is unbelievable. You're talking recovery. It's just not even in the question, right? So at the very least, if you take a look at, like, you're saying, don't just add recovery. Don't between Saturday and Sunday just be like, you did soft tissue before bed on Saturday. You did recovery. Take a step back and look at what her whole week looks like, what her whole program looks like while she's in season, to make sure that you're trying to find some sort of like equilibrium, some sort of balanced state for her in between this high level of competition. Would you say that's on point? That's
on point. And I think that goes back to these insane pitch counts that we create that are kind of like arbitrary. So the games on the weekend, and I may be wrong, but a pitcher will throw maybe 150 pitches in a game.
Sure, yeah.
But we're going to throw 300 the week leading up. And it's like, if we were a marathon runner, we wouldn't run 26 miles in the first week. We would build up to that. So it's like, put training in hindsight and put performance at the key, because that's what really matters.
For sure. I just had a visual pop in my brain. You talked about like the bucket being empty. I just literally pictured a pitcher like holding a bucket and us just like dumping water in it, as if we could just do like more, and like nothing is staying in that bucket. From a pitching standpoint, this is getting off a little bit of like from the velocity and recovery concept, but we know for sure that when pitchers are in season and they're throwing so much, the amount that they're pitching during the week is so minimal. And I'm saying during the week because this is like travel ball world I'm talking about when we're at the youth level. But in high school, they're obviously, they're pitching like every other day. That gets a little bit more challenging. And then at the college level, it's split. There's weekday games, and then there's obviously weekend series. So it's not always so clean cut. But we know that when we are really, really asking pitchers to do a lot on game days, and a lot in my mind is simply a single game. That's what I'm getting at. A lot is 100 plus pitches on a single day, and then asked to be returned the next day and do the same thing. Like if you're down a little bit, that curveball's off a little bit, not going to cut it. Like the demands stay really high. So leading up to that and right after the fact, because the cycle goes on and on with competition, you have to really make sure you're not overdoing it in training, right? The lead up, the build up off season to preseason is the time to start increasing increasing intensity and volume of that intensity. But knowing that that's when it's coming in season, you got to pull it down. Redefine the Circle is brought to you by Rapsodo Softball. Whether it's at the plate or in the circle, Rapsodo delivers all the data needed to enhance your players' development and to give us a platform to become more informed and better coaches. Rapsodo pitching is absolutely critical when it comes to maximizing your pitchers. In addition to measuring velocity, pitchers and coaches get a detailed look at all of the ball metrics that influence break: spin rate, spin direction, gyro degree, spin efficiency. Together, these metrics tell a story about a pitcher's data profile. And to grow that profile and ultimately maximize what that pitcher can become, understanding the metrics is a must. Rapsodo not only provides high-level feedback in the moment, but also creates back-end reports so coaches and athletes can visualize and fully understand the entire story and how it's progressing. Rapsodo is such a powerful tool. Instant data, relevant metrics, innovative visuals, and don't forget the in-app slow-mo video that allows pitchers to watch their pitching patterns right alongside the ball flight metrics they yield. Bottom line, Rapsodo is a must-have in the world of player development. See the data, feel the results with Rapsodo's softball technology. So let's talk a little bit about like, what do you do for recovery? So like, when people are like, okay, so what do they do? Should they do nothing? If it's like they need to recover, should they just stay at home that day? Should they, you said, adjust their workout sometimes? Like, I know the answer is likely from you're going to be like, it depends. Are they doing soft tissue that day? What are some scenarios that we really utilize here? Or what are some scenarios that we have seen here and strategies that we utilize at S2 when we're making sure that we're sort of reworking the amount of recovery that pitchers have throughout their week?
Yeah, I think context is really important here. When's your next game day, and how many days out from the game are they? If we're a day after game day, we're probably doing soft tissue work and an aerobic-based circuit on their mobility, and that's beneficial for the athletes. It's not a true lift, and that would be considered recovery. And a lot of the times, if you're working in a system with their strength and conditioning professional, they will have this built in, ready to go for you. But then you're talking about 3 days out from game day, more days out from game day. It doesn't make sense if we have a high intensity bullpen and then randomly the next day we throw in recovery. It's like, why would we do recovery 3 days out from game day? Why don't we just save that for when we actually need it and it's a part of our program? And that's then when in-season training goes wrong, because now you're not really thinking through and creating a system and creating something that the athlete can keep making gains in and then recover from. You're just kind of guessing.
Yeah, we talk about in-season training here at S2 Breakthrough. Like, the number one concept I think that families, remote athletes, in-house athletes, they come to us with are like, how can I train while in season? Like, I'm in high school season. We train, or we practice, we play 6 days a week. Like, how can I then plop something on top of that? And what we really try to express is, think about in-season training as like a giant management system, right? We're really just tracking like how much you're doing. We have athletes that play for schools or organizations or programs that it's kind of minimal. They're just kind of left to do what they need, and they can train a little bit higher intensity throughout the week. And others who are just getting hammered, right? Or like practices at 5 a.m. And then we have to take a different approach with those athletes, right? And so we talk about, like, we look at your circumstance of what the variables that are going on in your environment, in your system, and we help you manage that. And it fluctuates week by week. It fluctuates throughout the season if you're being used more or less. And so that's what in-season is. We have seen athletes not do in-season training, right? Like, they build all the way up. I think this happens with travel ball teams all the time. They're like, we're doing strength and conditioning this year as a team from January to March, and then it's over, right? And so then they're like, we did the strength. They think of it as like just strength. And then they're in season and nobody does anything but play. And so we have had the opportunity to see a lot of athletes who make that decision because they just don't feel like they can fit things in. They always think more. And we just watch their trends go down, right? And so what I see a lot on the pitching side is we watch their trend, their mobility go down. We watch their movement capacity or their trunk stability go down, but they're still throwing similar velocities, which just means that pitcher is pulling from all the wrong places, right? So this is back pain, shoulder pain, things that start to flare up, or their velocity goes down. But most of the time they figure out a way to stay with that velocity because velocity is king, velocity is queen, right? And so it's like, no matter what. So if we're going to demand that from our pitchers, if we're going to say, you've got to throw in this range, then you better know what's going in to making sure that athlete has the tools and has the strategies, has the recovery system built into her training, right? If you don't know anything about that, about an athlete, then simply requiring them to continue to throw at certain velocities is likely putting a bucket in their hand. It's already full of water and you're just dumping more and more right over top of them, right? And so I think, really circling back to the beginning of our discussion, that is why, forget whether or not our culture around velocity in softball pitching is healthy or not. The fact is, we have high demands when it comes to what we expect for pitchers when they throw. When they're 3, 4, 5 miles per hour off, we're like, what's going on, Sally? You know, like, you're not throwing hard today. So at the very least, with those demands, we have to start understanding recovery. Okay, so tell me about, let's go through a case study here, or a little bit of an example. You talked about earlier in this episode, stress is stress. So sometimes the stress is not coming from softball itself, it's coming from outside pieces. And we have a recent example of that about 2 weeks ago, an athlete that was here, a pitcher, and we, kind of had some discussions around that. So kind of lay out what that example looked like from your perspective.
So you're in the office one day and you're talking about an athlete and you're saying, wow, she's just slowly going downhill for me. And I'm like, well, I'm the opposite on the strength and conditioning floor. She's going up and she's making huge strides. So I knew this wasn't a strength and conditioning concept. I didn't have to go back to the whiteboard yet. And I started talking to her, what's going on? Are you okay? And she quickly revealed that she was having academic issues. She was commuting more. She was coming here more for lifts because she felt like she had to get more work in. And all of those things were just adding up to be way too much stress. So we ended up talking. We made the decision that she was going to train here less. She was only going to come 2 days a week. Those were going to be high-intensity days, but then that's it for the week. You don't lift anymore, and you're not doing any other conditioning. And so she was riding this downhill trend. We did that. We game planned that together, and then she has gone back up in the past week and a half.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to pull in a graph here. So as you know, I like to pull in some of these graphics or some of these visuals in these discussions, because when we're talking velocity, what I want to note is that the first and foremost, the reason I knew she was going downhill is because we have the data to show me, right? And so I mentioned this on a previous episode, but we don't just follow the data when it's showing us like we're doing great. That's wonderful, but it also tells us sometimes that something is wrong. And so here's an example of this graph. So if you follow all the way, this was over about end of January into kind of middle of February. So what I started to see was this. This is not a high velo pitcher. She sits like mid to upper 50. She's a high school athlete, so she's not a high velo pitcher. But because she actually spins the ball very, very well, and because she sits sort of like mid to upper 50s, it is really critical that her velocities don't really drop below that, right? So at the high school level, when all of a sudden now she's down a tier in velocity and she's in low 50s, really spin becomes irrelevant, right? And so velocity is important to her, even though it's not high velocity. And so what I started to see is, we're looking all the way over here to the left, is this trend that was slowly downhill. And not only was the trend down, but the overall values. I mean, she was dipping in the 40s, which I never see. I mean, this is a high school athlete. It was alarming. She was staring at me in sessions like, what's happening to me? And all I could say to her was, listen, let's just like ride it out for a second. We're not going to on the spot change everything, because it's tempting to do that as a pitching coach. I'm like on the spot, try to fix something. And I realize I almost always get it wrong when I do that. What really I need to do is go back into the office, pull in all the pieces, look at the information, see how long this has been happening, what's going on, look at her wellness questionnaires, talk to you. We pull the whole system in, right? That's when you came to me and you said, she started failing a class and she's now really stressed and all these things. This is my recommendation. I'm like, all right, we didn't change anything about programming. Like, we didn't go into the actual program and make a change for her. We just simply added in more recovery, less stress, right? And I mean, it was like almost immediate. It was like the next week. I think I wasn't even in the facility that one day, and I got a text like, she's throwing 57 plus now. Like, she looks unbelievable, totally different athlete. And it's just amazing. So if you're looking at this trend here, you can see when we allowed her to sort of take stress out of the equation, she jumped right back up into velocities that were a little more normal for her, and has been able to sustain that as she's going into sort of like right before high school season. And so I think that's a great example of, one, understanding that velocity moves, it fluctuates, that there are so many variables that play a role, and that you have to understand when you take in all that. One, you have to track it. You have to understand its story. And when you take in all those variables, you have to understand, like, stress is stress. We can't force her to, like, stop stressing about that class. Stop stressing about needing tutoring after school. Like, that's a constant. So what we knew that we could remove is for us. And that is what we considered, like, we added more recovery. We added more central nervous system recovery, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so I just think that's a really powerful story. I think what we've seen ultimately with the pitchers that we work with here, very rarely do we have to ask them to do more. In softball pitching, more is more is more is more, typically. That's the mindset that we see our athletes. And what we have to explain to them is, no, it's not, no, it's not, no, it's not, no, it's not. It's about making sure that the body and the brain can function optimally, that when you have to tap into things for performance, that you're prepared to do so. And if you're running the well dry, it's not going to get there, right? And so I think that's just a big discussion for us to have when we're talking about the demands we're placing on our pitchers, understanding that we are simply asking them to do too much, in addition to then placing these expectations on them that are sort of, just beyond what I think most humans are able to accomplish. So recovery, I think, is a discussion that I hope is something we can start to have more of a conversation about. I think in other sports, in the baseball world, recovery is certainly something that we are used to. We're used to, he throws this day and then he's off for this amount of days. It's a conversation that's really common in other sports and in softball pitching. Somewhere along the lines, I don't know who started this, but somebody started like, it's totally natural. No one, you can throw and throw and throw and throw, and everybody's great, everybody's fine. And it's like, okay, we've got it. That's 3 decades ago, 30 years ago, we thought that. We now know that's not true. And so we have to start looking at what are the demands on these athletes right now, and how can we do a better job supporting them to allow them to perform at such a high level. right? Okay, anything else in closing here, Car? Just if you had to give one additional sort of like public service announcement when it comes to recovery and what you've seen from pitchers here at S2.
It would be not to add more things in just for the sake of adding in recovery. I know a lot of the times we see collegiate staffs like adding in yoga or like a Pilates class, but it's early in the morning. So it's like you now just woke your athletes up at 4:30 in the morning to go do yoga, and they're not sleeping. Most of them probably have tests or exams, and they just had a road trip. It's like, let your athletes sleep, and that's recovery. Like, you just did recovery by having them sleep. And it's not, recovery is less of an action, but more of a system. And if there's one thing I can say, it's that. So systemize your process, bring in everyone on the staff, and quit feeling like you have to add things in. If anything, maybe take some out.
That's really good, Car. That's a mic drop. Good job. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. Redefine the Circle. Looking forward to next week's discussion where we talk about when we are actively trying to build velocity, when we want to take an athlete one step further with an aggressive approach in training. What exactly does that look like? So join us next week for more discussions about velocity and velocity culture. Until then, keep questing on to redefine the circle. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.